Hey everyone. Hi Brenda. How are you?
Hi Chantel, I'm great, and it's so fun to be here again.
I know it's our episode 2 of Nutrition Unpacked, and I'm really excited because we have a fantastic episode planned for our listeners. We're going to have Dr. Gil Carvalho joining us today to answer some very pertinent questions about the carnivore diet, which gives us both a heart attack.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited because he's just really digs deep. He's an amazing researcher, and excited to have him as a guest.
In fact, so if people don't know them, let's give them an introduction with the bio that you're going to read out, because I think people then can see how he's got a lot of accolades and he's just such a knowledgeable person.
Yeah, so Dr. Carvalho, and it's spelled with an L but pronounced Carvalho, I just learned. He's from Portugal. So anyway, he's an MD, PhD, a neuroscientist and researcher at the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. He obtained his medical doctorate from the University of Lisbon and a PhD in biology from Caltech. Gil was a lead co-investigator with Antonio Damasio in The Nature of Feelings, Evolutionary and Neurobiological Origins. He is published in academic journals such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Nature Reviews and Neuroscience, Trends in Neurosciences and Current Biology, and his work has been cited over 1,000 times. Dr. Carvalho's research examining the role of non-synaptic communication in the interoceptive nervous system is presented in his most recent publication, Non-Synaptic Transmission and the Foundations of Affect. And Carvalho and Damasio suggest that non-synaptic transmission makes a fundamental contribution to the process of sensing visceral states, which is really essential to the capacity to feel and the foundation of effective processing. Dr. Carvalho hosts a YouTube channel called Nutrition Made Simple, which is honestly an incredible resource. And so we are so privileged today to have them with us.
Absolutely. So we're just waiting for him to join us. It will be a moment, I think. I am excited about this topic actually, because when we talk about, obviously, we unpacking the myth that we have online, and basically, there is so much. There are so many claims on the internet about this diet, and it just really breaks my heart that a lot of people started following it and truly will experience long-term issues. Dr. Carvalho will be 5 minutes with us, so we can start talking about why we really wanted to talk about this subject, which is so, for us, is really deep into the misunderstanding of nutrition online, when people just make claims without nuisance. Because a carnivore diet, I think we both appreciate, although we are vegans, we don't actually appreciate the diet, but we appreciate that it can be an elimination diet. But making claims of the way that this is the way human beings are meant to eat, this is what really bothers me, because so many people follow it, and we see a lot of people actually suffering the consequences of this already.
Oh, for sure. And you know, I was part of a group that wrote a diet on ketogenic, or wrote a paper on ketogenic diets. It was published, I think, in 2021, called Ketogenic Diets and Chronic Disease, Weighing the Benefits Against the Risks. And that was with Lee Crosby as the senior author. But it was, we looked at all of the evidence we could find on outcomes associated with ketogenic diets, and it wasn't terribly favorable.
Yeah, and I guess that's how people do it as well. Do you think we could do a ketogenic approach like Dr. Goldner on a plant-based diet?
We can. It's just really hard because plants contain a lot of carbohydrates. Most plants are, close to 60 to 90% plus carbohydrates.
Mm.
And so when you're trying to minimize carbs to get them below 50 grams a day or 20 to 50 or whatever, however, intense you're doing this program, it just doesn't allow for very many plant foods. So even, a cup of blueberries or, many vegetables, you can't eat the volumes that we would normally eat in a plant-based diet. And so when you think about foods that are really high in fat that would make it work, you're thinking about a lot of oils. You can do nuts and seeds; they're lower in carbohydrates. You can do avocados, but most plant foods are fairly high in carbohydrates. So it's
Yeah,
just a real juggling act. And the quality, when you look at the U.S. diet ratings, keto always comes out last or second last because it's so nutritionally inadequate. There's so many micronutrient shortfalls in this diet that it's a problem health wise, and so that's something that people need to think about as well.
that's interesting because I saw that there's a lot of research happening at Harvard University to see if the ketogenic diet could have some clinical place for mental issues, ADHD. And so I wonder, there's obviously not a defined answer for this. Again, we don't have long-term studies, although people do make claims about that too, including Trump, I believe. Or
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, one thing we do know is that ketogenic diets were really designed to help children with epilepsy, and part of it has to do with the way that glucose was managed in the brain and the transporters of glucose not working properly, and so, when the brain was running on ketones, it was much safer for these children, that, especially those that wouldn't respond to medications. And so, when you think about it from that sense, if somebody has some issues with glucose transport in the brain, ketones can be very useful.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting and very essential to know. Because obviously we want to make sure people don't just follow these things as trends. And I think it's really clear it was designed to be a clinical approach and not a diet for the mainstream. How did it become so popular?
I think people enjoy eating meat. And so one of the things that it does is, when you're eating a ketogenic diet, you're really getting rid of a lot of processed foods. You're trying to minimize carbohydrates. So there's none of these salty snacks and baked goods and ice cream and all of these things that we know are associated with negative health outcomes are eliminated pretty quickly. But what you're left with, the thing that people forget about is there's really two categories of foods that are mostly responsible for all the negative health outcomes we see, and that's highly processed foods or ultra processed low nutrient foods, and animal products. And so, but what the ketogenic diet does is gets rid of a lot of those ultra processed foods, but it doesn't get rid of the animal products. It really highlights those or emphasizes those, and so it's a huge problem from that respect. But I think the way it got popular is that it is pretty effective in helping people lose weight
Yeah.
initially, and that it can, when you lose weight, a lot of your markers improve, and so in the short term, and so I think that's very attractive to people, and people can still eat their big slabs of meat and a salad or whatever, and that seems to be doable for people somehow. So.
That is true. Actually, I've seen, thankfully, in a way, I've seen people use a new term called ketobiotic when it comes to hormonal health and eating for our hormones, emphasizing the fact that estrogen doesn't like high glucose to thrive, but that fiber is very important because obviously we need a good microbiome, and especially things like the estrobolome, which is a particular gut bacteria that will process and basically to get rid of excess hormone that is not meant to be in the body again. And the approach here is to basically have a lot of vegetables and good fats, but not have starches on those days where you want to support estrogen rising, and then adding as more starches when we have progesterone rising days. So in the luteal phase, for example, and in ovulation. And I think that's a really balanced approach because again, we can keep our sugar levels, we can still go into ketosis, but it's not long term, which also has a big effect on our health if we are in ketosis for a long period of time. But also we're not getting rid of the most important thing, which is fiber for our microbiome.
Yeah, exactly.
We talked about this actually in a way last week because we're worried about the new guidelines being very heavy in fats and from animal products especially, and animal
Yeah.
meat. And that is very much a ketogenic approach, isn't it? In the new guidelines when you look at it.
Yeah, we're leaning in that direction at least somewhat.
Yeah.
They,
Yeah.
in the section on chronic disease, they promote low carbohydrate diets as being probably the best option, it seems, because they don't mention any other diets as being effective for chronic disease, which is just shocking to me. But yeah, I'm actually doing an entire hour and a half presentation on the dietary guidelines for the Real Truth About Health on April 17th. So people
Amazing.
may want to catch that one.
Yeah, we'll definitely share it also as our podcast will come out at the end of April. So it's going to be quite nice to the show
Perfect
when,
timing.
perfect timing, exactly. As I said last time, like we really need to harp on this because it feels very um, misguided and we are worried about people, not having enough information and listening to the basically the headlines that don't say anything really in details, which is why the conversation we're going to have with Dr. Carvalho when he joins um, is important because he obviously has a lot of knowledge when it comes to cardiovascular disease. So today, although we could spend hours demystifying so many myths online because there are so many claims about everything, we're going to focus on heart health because he actually really is an expert in cardiovascular disease, understanding LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, ApoB, like things that we don't talk about enough online, and it's very nuisance. And when we see the claims of the carnivore camps when it comes to LDL not being an issue, so it's really it's gonna be a very good conversation to
And
have.
an important conversation because it's so confusing for consumers when they're hearing things from the opposite ends of the spectrum all the time. I think he's got such insight. So yeah, very very excited to hear what he has to say.
He also, he also has a predisposition to he has to make sure that he basically looks after himself. Like he had a time where his levels were very high, so he actually showed and shared online about his progress, making sure that he looks after himself and even the use of statins, different kinds of statins to help him out. So in his show Nutrition Made Simple, he really does share a lot of insights from his experience, his predisposition to having issues with high cholesterol, for example, and how to bring it down naturally through food, but also helping with medication. And again, I think when it comes to the camp of the carnivores, one of the things that really worries me is how it's very conspiratorial in many ways, and telling people that yes, and we know big pharma does run the show. We're not saying that they're the good guys, but it's also we have to understand sometimes you need to have medications, otherwise the repercussion will be worse than not having it at all. So it's
Oh,
really important.
absolutely. There's no question that medications can save a lot of lives, and are a very, very valuable tool in our toolbox for treating various diseases. And there's certain conditions where there's just we don't, they don't respond to lifestyle changes, for example.
Do, do
Yeah.
you when you do your lectures, do you see people challenging you about the plant-based diet and trying to bring up that that's not a natural diet?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the idea that it's not a natural diet, I can remember when the paleo diet came out, and it was just such a big thing at the gym I was going to. And almost every single one of our instructors was following a paleo diet. And it really bothered me. And so I thought I need to do some research and figure out what's going on here. And I did as much research on what paleo diets really were. And so looked at, Boyd Eaton and Melvin Connor's work, and they actually estimated beautifully, the macro and micronutrient intakes of people during the Paleolithic period. And yes, protein was pretty high, but when I was comparing the current paleo diet, what people call the paleo diet, and the vegan diet and the true Paleolithic diet, the vegan diet was way closer to the true Paleolithic diet than what people were calling paleo. So I think Dr. Carvalho has
Just joined us.
joined us.
Hi, apologies.
Hello.
Please call me Gil.
Hi, Gil.
Sorry about that. Somebody rang my doorbell just as I was about to log on.
No worries.
I'm just so excited to meet you. Enjoyed I've enjoyed your interviews so much, and I'm just so happy that you're in the world and helping to just provide such valuable, wonderful information. So very excited to meet you.
Oh, that's so nice. I mean, it means a lot. Thank you so much for your kind words. I'm familiar with your work. I've watched a lot of your content, a lot of your interviews over the years.
Thank you.
I didn't realize you were familiar with what I do, but it's a pleasure to hear that it's considered helpful.
And very helpful. And I really enjoyed your interview with Simon Hill, and I think I listened to it 2 or 3 times.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I've been on Simon's podcast, I think twice now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's great stuff. Yeah, we were on a panel recently with Chantel organized late last year, right? I think it was November or something.
Yeah,
That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
you were together. We didn't have the time to unfortunately really converse much, but
No.
there were so many questions. Yeah. But yeah, you were together, and I'm really proud. Like I'm really happy to be with obviously A players here because we all want to share information that is helpful and to really help people actually understand how to be healthy without going to extremes and falling to fads. And of course, Jill, you and I spoke about the fact that there are so many claims that we could spend hours on like going through this, but we're going to focus on cardiovascular disease because you are actually a pro when it comes to understanding what's going on with the LDL, HDL, and the other nuisance and other things we should test, and the claims that the carnivores make when it comes to heart health, which is, dangerous to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to answer a lot of these questions over the years on my channel. So I think I have a little bit of practice doing that, but I obviously haven't been as successful as I would wish because these questions are still out there. It's very hard to completely clarify. But yeah, I think we've had some success over the years. I do see progress, and I do see people. It is gradually sinking in.
Yes, I agree. So perhaps we can start with we already did the introduction to your wonderful work. We sang your praises before you joined us, and we would love to.
I should have been here for that.
Yeah, I know. We'd love to listen to the recording. we would love to just go dive deeply into this. So I have sent you a list of the claims that we see from carnivores. There are many, 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 especially from Paul Saladino, who our friend Simon also points out quite a lot that he makes a lot of mistakes and says things that are not quite accurate. So the first one, I think, to simplify it all, is they say LDL is not important and that a high LDL is actually healthy because we need LDL to be healthy. metabolically and also cardiovascularly.
Yeah, so I think one thing that makes a lot of these claims resonate with the public is that sometimes there's a nugget of truth, and then there's like a lot of misrepresentation and taking things out of context. So it really depends what you mean by LDL. It is possible to say LDL is not the real cause and be scientifically correct if you explain it really, really well, which is hard to do. So I think if we take a step back, and Brenda, by all means, jump in anytime, or anything that is confusing, or you want to. So yeah, I just want to maybe take a step back and explain the basics, because I think once we understand the basic principle, everything else kind of makes sense. So heart disease, first of all, there's many types of heart disease, but the most common one and the most lethal one is atherosclerosis, blackening the artery walls. It's the one that kills more humans than any other single cause worldwide. And so that's caused by these tiny little particles that float around in our blood. We call them lipoproteins. The name doesn't really matter for now. So these little particles float around, and this is nature's way of transporting fats in the bloodstream. So the body needs to traffic cholesterol, triglycerides, all these different types of lipids. And we all know fat and water doesn't mix well. You've done the experiment in the kitchen. So same thing would happen in the body. If you had fats traveling in the blood just by themselves, they would kind of clump up. It doesn't work. So nature came up with this clever ruse, which is to package the lipids in these little particles called lipoproteins. So they're like little submarines, or whatever metaphor you like, to transport the fats back and forth from the liver to the different tissues and back and forth. All of that is normal. All of that is physiological. It's all happening in all of us as we speak. Now, the problem arises when there are too many of these particles in circulation. Just like any other metric, right? Glucose is too high, you have a problem. Potassium is too high, sodium is too high. Most physiological parameters, if they're out of bounds, you get into problems. Same thing with lipoproteins. If there's too many, they can get stuck inside the artery wall at a pace that is unnatural or too quick for health, let's say, and the plaque accumulates inside the artery wall. So that's the basic phenomenon. And then obviously there's all kinds of details, but that's the basic realization here. All of these risk factors that we know, smoking, inflammation, high glucose, obesity, all these things that we all recognize, all of these things accelerate the process. None of them are necessary. You can have heart disease without any of these things, but all of them accelerate. Some of them speed up the transport of the lipoproteins into the artery wall. Some of them cause damage to the artery wall, which speeds up the process as well. But none of that is necessary, because the transport is actually physiological. The problem is we call it retention. They get stuck inside the artery wall, and the plaque gradually builds over decades. So that's the foundation. Now, from there, it becomes easier to explain the misconceptions. When they say LDL is not the cause, oftentimes they're conflating the particle, the lipoprotein that we talked about, the little vehicle in the blood, with the blood test LDL cholesterol. So this gets a little confusing, because scientists are often not the best at coming up with names for stuff. Everything sounds very confusing. And so when you get a basic lipid panel, you get your total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides. These are all measures of the amount of these different lipids in the blood inside these little vehicles, right? But we said that what causes the disease is the number of the vehicles. So why are we measuring something else? Why are we measuring the amount of fats inside the vehicles? It seems confusing. For historical reasons, these are the metrics that have become more firmly established in the field, and a lot of the data is based on these metrics. They were measured more commonly back, decades ago. So this is typically what's done, but measuring the actual number of vehicles is a better, more reliable metric of the risk. What happens when you look at these fat quantities, the amount of LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, they correlate. They give you a general trend, sometimes it gets it wrong. So it's not a great metric. It's a useful first read, but yes, sometimes it gets it wrong, and it is good in cardiologists to do this. They go beyond just that basic lipid panel, and they measure other things like ApoB, which we could talk about. It's the account of the actual number of the vehicles. So that's just a first pass. I don't want to hog the time, but just a first kind of introduction into the basics.
Thank you for that. I don't know if you want to add anything, Brenda.
No, that covered it really beautifully.
So my next question about another claim that they make, because I think there is a nice interplay between different elements, as you just shared now. Another big claim that they make is if HDL is high and triglycerides are low, high LDL then is fine. And he thinks that Saladino, argues that LDL and cardiovascular disease association is weaker when HDL is actually high.
Yeah, it's the same misconception. This is why it's important to explain that the particles versus fats first, because once you understand that, all of this falls into place. This comes from some of these classical studies from Framingham, where they're looking at these fats in the blood. And so again, these fats will generally correlate with risk. Why? Because people who have more particles, more lipoproteins, tend to have a larger amount of fats trafficking. This is like if you think in terms of like buses on the road, right, or vehicles on the road. If you count, you can count the number of vehicles. Okay, there's these many buses or these many cars, or you can count the number of passengers traveling at any given time. In general, if there's more people on the road, there are going to be more vehicles. There's going to be a correlation, but it's not going to be perfect, right? Because you can have a bus that's full of people or empty, and so there's a disconnect there. We call that a discordance. In lipidology, it's called discordance. It's when the number of vehicles and the amount of fats, the amount of passengers doesn't match. When that happens, the number of vehicles prevails. So it's the number of the lipoproteins that determines risk. The fats are a rough estimate. So yeah, you can look at somebody's LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and get a general idea. They're red flags that are valid, but they get things wrong all the time. All three of them. So high LDL cholesterol doesn't necessarily mean you're in trouble. Depends on the number of vehicles. High triglycerides, exact same thing. If you have very high triglycerides, generally you have more vehicles because they traffic the triglycerides back and forth, and it's a large type of vehicle that are actually quite nasty. But if your triglycerides are high, but your number of vehicles is not high, you're fine. And trials have done this. Reducing triglycerides without reducing the number of vehicles doesn't do anything. So these things are red flags, but always remember, you're looking at indirect measures that sometimes get things wrong. So over-focusing on triglycerides, HDL, and even LDL cholesterol will often get things wrong. And the irony is these folks like to point to the weaknesses of these metrics, but then they use those weaknesses to make their arguments, thereby making all the mistakes that they accuse others of doing. But once you understand these basic principles, it becomes really clear. So yes, statistically, populations that have low HDL and high triglycerides are at higher risk, because those populations, and this has been shown in study after study, they are fatter, more diabetes, higher blood pressure, smoke more, eat worse, exercise less, and higher number of vehicles, higher ApoB in those populations. So they have every risk factor in these studies, very clear. That does not mean that have higher HDL is protective. It is not protective. You can raise HDL genetically, pharmacologically, it provides no protection. So having high HDL does not mean you're protected. If your number of vehicles is high, the high HDL is not going to protect you at all. So when in doubt, look at the number of vehicles, calculate your ApoB, calculate your non-HDL cholesterol. We can talk about that, how to do that, very easy, for free. But don't fall for these simple tropes on the internet.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the things that we definitely have to see a change in is perhaps also how doctors test cholesterol, because they only really so far they only really go for LDL and HDL and the total cholesterol, but they don't actually measure ApoB. If we are not if it's not cardiologists, they don't look at it. They don't even look at OAPOA. They don't look at these protein that you mentioned, these vehicles that you mentioned. And so this feeds into the problem, because if a doctor is not mentioning these things to their patients, they don't know about it. When they then listen online to just LDL and HDL and the simplification of it, then they're like, yeah, this makes sense. So I'm gonna just have to, not worry about it, because my doctor like doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Like, it's really, really simple to misguide people this way. And there's a claim that Paul and Anthony Shafee make, which are about the fact that ApoB only really matters if there's inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. I guess they're talking mostly about sugar metabolism, maybe, but that a normal carnivore diet is not the true driver for it. And basically, you can eat as much meat as possible.
Yeah, it's not based on anything scientific. I mean, the inflammation and so there's two levels to inflammation, right? There's generalized inflammation, where your inflammatory markers are high. You have an inflammatory condition like IBD or rheumatoid arthritis. A lot of these conditions, your state is your body's in a state of general inflammation, and yes, that speeds up heart disease. But none of it is necessary. So people who don't have those conditions still have heart disease. Lots of people, millions of people. So it's a factor. It's an accelerant, but it's not necessary. And this has been done in trials. They've taken people with different levels of inflammatory markers and reduced their particles with pharmacologically, and you get a reduction of risk of heart attacks, regardless whether you have high inflammation or not. You still get a benefit. So we know it's not necessary. It's worse if you have a high number of particles and you have generalized inflammation. You're in worse shape. Just like if you also smoke and if you also have diabetes, it compounds. But if you don't have inflammation and your number of particles is through the roof, you're at higher risk. There's not being inflamed is not going to save you if you have the propensity for the disease and if the main risk factor is there, which is the number of particles. So yeah.
And we make an honorable mention to seed oils, because when it comes to inflammation, that's the first thing to mention, that seed oils are really inflammatory, therefore they do cause heart disease.
By the way, just on last note,
yeah,
having on this point of the inflammation, having a lot of particles causes inflammation. It's not the generalized type, but it's the localized type. So when you have too many particles and you don't have a genetic makeup that just protects you from the disease, which can anytime it can happen with any risk factor, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, if you have the propensity to form plaque, once those particles get into the artery wall and get retained, that causes inflammation locally. So one thing leads to the other. The inflammation that is a part and parcel of cardiovascular of atherosclerosis, which is that localized inflammation in the artery wall, happens inevitably once the particles are in there at an abnormal amount and get retained, and then there's a whole inflammatory response. As far as the seed oils and inflammation, I've done a vast literature search, and I'd love to hear also Brenda's experience, but I've tried to go through the literature. I have a video that's like 40 minutes long covering dozens of trials, cohort studies. We see virtually nothing pointing to a pro-inflammatory role of seed oils. If anything, in the longer observational studies, we see that people who have a higher level of linoleic acid, which is the main type of omega-6, in their bodies have lower levels of inflammatory markers. So if anything, they seem to be anti-inflammatory. If you want to be conservative, taking the totality of the evidence, no effect either way would be the conservative statement. But a pro-inflammatory effect is incredibly difficult. They've even looked in different genetic populations, people who had genetics that, at least in theory, would make them more prone to that effect. Still, they didn't see a significant increase in inflammatory markers. So this is a theory based on like biochemical pathways, that linoleic acid gets converted into leukotrienes and other molecules that have a pro-inflammatory effect. But this is not how we determine public health and dietary advice, because you got to look at the actual health effects in human beings, because the same pathway also produces anti-inflammatory molecules. So you could make the other argument. So you have to look at actual trials and actual human outcomes to see what happens. So this is pretty straightforward if you actually look at the evidence, but the anti-seed oil folks like to kind of cherry pick mechanistic arguments and just run with that. But it's pretty, I think it's pretty simple to see that it doesn't hold water.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I think it's one of the most frustrating things about the new dietary guidelines as well, where they're promoting beef tallow and butter, and it's that, I think that stems from this anti-seed oil movement. And just to clarify, seed oils are things like sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil, many of the sort of vegetable oils we think of, and the evidence is really pretty strong that that these oils are probably protective. Certainly not. They certainly don't increase inflammation. But in many cases, evidence shows that they may be anti-inflammatory. And when we replace the beef tallow and butter with seed oils, we get, a reduction in LDL cholesterol. We get a reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. And so, and the research is really pretty impressive. I mean, whether it's clinical trials or large cohort studies, they all show benefit. And so where they're pulling this out of is as Jill mentioned, just this idea of the inflammatory pathways based on, linoleic acid being converted to arachidonic acid and producing various eicosanoids, leukotrienes, and thromboxanes, and so on, that may be pro-inflammatory versus omega-3 pathway that tends to produce more eicosanoids that are anti-inflammatory. But in reality, that doesn't tell the whole story. And in fact, linoleic acid can be converted, of course, to GLA, which is, and dihomogamma-linolenic acid that can be anti-inflammatory as well. So it's a big story, and but the research that really matters is the the clinical trials and the cohort studies that show these oils are actually beneficial, especially when they're replacing saturated fats.
Yeah, I agree. And there is something else when it comes to this. I think in the ketogenic and carnivore space. So Jill, you obviously explained really well the correlation between high ApoB, LDL, and like all the other markers may be fine, but if you have, if you have a high ApoB, then there's a problem there. But one thing they harp about is a calcium scores. So the one of the statements that they make is that actually if you have a 0 calcium score, then even high LDL and ApoB is not harmless. It's not harmful.
Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. So calcium shows up in the process of atherosclerosis, but it's a relatively late step in the process. So it takes normally decades for calcium to appear. So it depends on the age. If you are elderly and if you've had high ApoB, let's say you've had, just to make the case clearer, let's say you're 75 or 80 and you've had a high ApoB most of your adult life and you have a calcium score of 0, I agree, that makes me worry a lot less, because that tells me that person likely doesn't have that individual susceptibility to build plaque, and they just can withstand the risk factor. I would still do maybe another type of scan that's more sensitive, but that does relax me a lot with regard to that sort of age. Now, if you're 40 or 30 or 45 and your calcium score is 0, that's the norm in our society. Most people in their 40s, in a society where most people where heart disease is the number one cause of death, most people in their 30s or 40s have a calcium score of 0. And that's because the calcium pops up later. They call it conversion. You have a calcium score of 0, and then later it's not 0. Nope. And none of these people that die of heart attacks, whatever it is, a third of Americans die of cardiovascular disease. They're not born with a calcium score that's high. It becomes higher than 0 later on, typically in their 50s and 60s. So the age there is crucial. If you're 30 or 40 and your calcium score is higher than 0, that's a huge red flag that you probably have a big susceptibility. And if you're 40 and your calcium score is 0, that tells you very little. I mean, you've ruled out, red alert, but my calcium score is 0 and I'm not, it's not a get out of jail free card. I'm still taking precautions, a lot of them. So it's just understanding it depends on the timeline.
Yeah, Brenda and I were actually talking before you joined that you share a lot of content that's very personal to your own journey and precautions that you're taking because of the history of heart disease in your family and how you've been, playing with different kinds of statins and seeing what helps you and doesn't raise obviously sugar levels or glucose and truly OA1C in this case, but you truly played around to like test on yourself to actually see how this methodology can help you in staying healthy long term. And I think it's such a the transparency that you portray on your channel is really, really key for people to see that this is not a conspiracy, because we were talking earlier about how one of the claims from the carnivore camp is that obviously big pharma runs everything, so everything is a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, and I think people really need to understand that the calcified plaque. It's really there's when you look at a calcium a score of 0 for coronary artery calcium, it means we don't have any detectable calcified plaque and probably a low 5 to 10 year risk of a heart attack. But what a lot of people don't realize is atherosclerosis begins before calcium appears in plaque. And so early plaque is often non-calcified. So the score of 0 doesn't rule out that disease is progressing or happening or being initiated. And so that's really important. And I think people need to understand that.
Great. And there is something else that I'd like to actually point out. So one of the claims is that saturated fats are necessary, they're essential for our well-being because we need it to create cholesterol. And I mean, most people don't actually know that we make cholesterol. So can we just clarify that part?
Yeah, but Brenda, do you want to jump in or should I?
Oh, you go right ahead, please.
Saturated fat, neither saturated fat nor cholesterol are essential nutrients, and we have here a registered dietitian who can correct me if I'm wrong. Neither one are essential nutrients, meaning that your body makes all the cholesterol you need. Your cells throughout your body produce cholesterol, all kinds of cells, and so you don't need to consume it. It's okay to have some cholesterol in the diet, but your body doesn't require cholesterol. And a key distinction here is the compartment in the body. So one thing is inside the cells where cholesterol is produced and utilized. Another thing is the bloodstream, the blood level, the serum level. It's just like glucose. Glucose exists throughout your body. If you didn't have any glucose inside you would not be alive. However, you don't want high levels of glucose in the blood. That's called diabetes, right? In the blood, you have a certain physiological range. Exact same thing is true for these lipoproteins and the cholesterol level within reason. So having higher cholesterol doesn't help your body in any way. It raises your risk if it's reflecting higher number of particles. It raises your risk of heart disease, And there's no reason to be hypercholesterolemic or hyper lipoproteinemic. It's just a complete misconception and a conflation of these different compartments.
Thank you for that. Brenda, anything to add?
Well, I think that people again need to understand that we don't need to eat cholesterol because our bodies are cholesterol making machines. We produce more than enough cholesterol. Some people even produce too much, but we produce plenty. And saturated fat is this same story. Saturated fat doesn't serve as a necessary substrate for cholesterol production. It modulates cholesterol levels indirectly, and by in a number of ways. But what really influences cholesterol synthesis is our internal needs, our dietary intake of cholesterol, our hormonal synthesis, or hormonal signals, I should say. And if dietary cholesterol is low, the body just makes more. It doesn't need saturated fat to do that.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask this question because obviously there's another common misunderstanding online that ties into this. So we make our own cholesterol, and generally, if you make your own, unless you have hypercholesterolemia, it's not a problem. But the one, going back to the statins, the one claim that they make is that obviously statins is very dangerous because actually lowering LDL cholesterol is incredibly dangerous because we need cholesterol for certain functions in our body.
Yeah, I can touch on that real quick. So the two main concerns that people have with regards to that is hormones and cognitive function. So we have lots of studies on statins. First of all, you can measure your own hormones and see. I had no problem when I started statins. It didn't change, and you can see in trials that's usually not an issue. Sometimes you see a small change, but it's within the normal range. The physiological explanation is that, again, most cells in your body produce their own cholesterol, and the glands that produce these hormones, they're producing their own cholesterol. So they don't need these LDL particles to come provide cholesterol. If they happen to need a bit extra, they can get it from other particles like HDL particles. So no one needs to be hypercholesterolemic for hormones to be produced. That's not a thing. The brain is even more straightforward because the brain also makes its own cholesterol. In fact, it's separated. There are separate compartments. The blood-brain barrier, lipoproteins don't really get through. There's no meaningful interchange. There's a whole different set of lipoproteins that work within the brain. It's like a different road system. And so the brain produces their own. You do not need high levels of cholesterol in the blood for the brain to make cholesterol. Now, there's another concern that's separate, which is, can statins reduce the production of cholesterol in the brain? Right, separate from the plasma levels. And there's some legitimate controversy there, but basically you look at, and I can use my own example. Like you look at your own, or you look at the outcome of trials, right? In terms of cognitive function, we don't see a decline in cognitive ability in statin trials and long-term follow-up. If anything, what we see is a reduction of dementia and Alzheimer's in people on statins on cohort studies, in observational cohort studies. So the signal, if anything, is pointing in the opposite direction, and that might be because it prevents the blockage of arteries going up to the brain. So if there's an issue there, it hasn't been picked up in these studies of statins, which are quite extensive. So that's my personal bet. I'm just making that note of caution that it is a possibility that statins lower cholesterol production in the brain in some individuals, and because some lipidologists make this note of caution, and Dr. Dave Spring advises measuring some specialized metabolites in the brain and then adjusting your statins. So just be aware that is a thing that isn't quackery, but that doesn't mean that we want to have that we want to be hypercholesterolemic to protect the brain. That's nonsense.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, we've got lots of trials that have looked at very low LDL levels, even trials that have used, statins and PCSK9 inhibitors, and they consistently find the reduction, continued reduction in heart attack and stroke risk. They haven't found big, problems, safety signals in most of the populations. And then they've also looked at populations that just naturally have very low LDL. And these populations are at super low cardiovascular risk. They don't see adverse health effects in these people. So I completely agree with Jill. It's just, I think they're fabricating issues where there aren't any.
Yeah, they are. In fact, there is another one that is probably tying into this, is that we can prove that LDL is not dangerous, and actually lowering is dangerous because when people have heart attacks, their LDL is really low, really low. Yes, so being high is not a problem. Take it away,
Yeah,
Jill.
this one is almost comedy, and I've seen doctors say this. I've had debates with doctors who say this, and it's comedy, but it's not, because it's so sad. So there's multiple explanations for this and well understood. So first of all, when you have a heart attack, cholesterol levels drop acutely in the acute setting. And that's not unique to cholesterol. Lots of these metrics drop in the context of shock, heart attack or trauma or infections. So it's called acute stress response. Acute phase response is what they call it in studies. So you see a dramatic change in these metrics in the acute phase of one of these events. So some of these studies, what they're doing is they have people who are coming into the ER with an acute myocardial infarction, with a heart attack. They're just having the heart attack, and they do some blood work, and their cholesterol is normal. Well, that cholesterol just dropped 30% from what they used to be, from what it used to be a couple of days before, right? So people are taking these studies and saying, see, these people are having heart attacks with normal cholesterol. I mean, it's like looking at the car crash and saying the cars are stopped, so speed that has nothing to do with the accidents. You're looking at the wrong slice of time. You have to look when the accident happened, or what happened, what led to the accident. So that's one. Another is that a lot of these people are already on lipid-lowering medication because they had high lipids and high risk factors, sometimes plaque and sometimes angina. They are on medication that artificially lower their lipids. And then they have a lot of plaque accumulated and they have a heart attack. Oh, they had normal lipids. Yeah, but they had the plaque accumulated from 30 years of having it too high. So I think this is the number one realization. Always understand these diseases build over decades. So all of these tropes of pointing to one time point and say, oh, here's the guy. Just yesterday I was saying something on Twitter and somebody says, oh, here's a vegan with plaque. Guys, first of all, we don't know when the plaque happened. Second, vegan doesn't mean you're Superman. Like these things are so silly. So always bear in mind temporality, right? Plaque builds over decades, and so it could have built over 20 or 30 years. Then your cholesterol got lowered pharmacologically, for example, or because you had the heart attack. Now you measure it. That doesn't tell you what the cholesterol was or what the lipoprotein count was over the previous 50 years.
Yeah, good. And actually, it's good that you said that, because we had a Dr. Joel Kahn, who I think has been just operated for a cardiovascular event or prevention. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't know what happened. I just saw his post about being in the hospital, and he's obviously plant-based vegan. And he's a cardiologist, and he still had, to deal with this. And as you said, like we all have the chance of getting issues. We can do things to prevent. We can be wise, and definitely we don't want to put the nail in the coffin. And I think with the carnivore diet, we really are building a coffin that is full of nails,
Yeah, you're increasing risk. It's just understanding that things aren't all or nothing. I think this is a very difficult concept to understand statistics and likelihood, and most people look at it in terms of black and white,
Mm.
all or nothing. But understanding that all of this is about odds, and some things increase your risk, some things decrease your risk. I mean, some non-smokers have lung cancer. It's possible, and lots of heavy smokers don't have lung cancer. So it's all statistical. But if you smoke, your risk is 10 times or whatever it is higher, right? So it's all about, it's like a casino. You're playing your odds, and over the long run, you tend to win if you play well, and if you play poorly, you tend to lose most of your hands. It's the same thing.
Yeah. There is also another one that I think probably can bring it up together because again, it just shows that people are not looking, or the people in the carnivore sphere, like Sean Becker and I think Ken Berry, especially, they always talk about the fact that if you have a lean body, then you are completely safe from having cardiovascular disease, even though if your LDL is high, because your lean mass is very low. Your lean mass is very high and your fat mass is low. And so this obviously I haven't seen any studies that shows this. So these claims appeal to people because it's like the protein topic is really appealing because people think about how the body looks, talk about fiber, they think about poop, and it's not a very appealing thing to talk about. So I feel that they really harp on these kind of sensationalism and aesthetics that is actually an outcome of what we see on social media.
Yeah, it's a separate risk factor, right? It's an accelerant. If you have obesity on top of having, and by the way, people who have more body fat tend to have a higher level of lipoproteins. So these things are not completely separate either. There's some overlap. And some of the risk that is accrued by being very overweight or obese might be because you have more lipoproteins, very likely. That is at least a part of the risk. But yeah, it's not necessary. This has been shown over and over. People who are lean can have heart disease and can have heart attacks. It's been shown in trials also, if you reduce the number of lipoproteins, regardless of BMI, high BMI, so obese, overweight, normal BMI, you see a reduction in risk in all strata. So it's not necessary. Of course, it's worse if you have more risk factors on top of each other. But if your number of lipoproteins is too high, and if you have the propensity, it can happen to you.
Yeah. Brenda, anything to add?
I just completely agree. Being lean certainly helps with insulin sensitivity and reduces blood pressure, and it tends to lower triglycerides and lowers risk of type 2 diabetes, generally has favorable impacts on metabolic health. But it doesn't mean it is will make you bulletproof because it won't. But the primary causal driver of cardiovascular disease is ApoB containing lipoproteins, and you can be lean and still have high LDL, high ApoB. You can still develop plaque. You can have inflammation. So it doesn't make you bulletproof for sure.
Yeah. And Jill, have you seen this? This encompasses all the questions that we found. We kind of lumped them together because a lot of the claims are the same. But have you seen anything we didn't discuss online that really makes your blood boil sometimes?
I mean, I think I've heard everything at this point, especially on heart disease. I think from very few things make my blood boil anymore. I think I get frustrated when I see health professionals, and especially people who have sometimes cardiologists on the rare occasion, saying absolute slop. I mean, that's just unbelievable. But that's less frequent. MDs saying absurdities about heart disease is common on the internet. So that I find less understandable. But if it's a civilian, someone just saying, I think that's normal. It is something that takes a little bit of exposure to understand the basics, and I think I consider it my job to try to repeat these messages and try to explain. One thing also that I've noticed, and I'm very curious to hear if Brenda has the same experience, because I think she's been at this much longer than I have. A lot of times, these myths and the resistance to the scientific studies, sometimes it's not a lack of information. There's almost an emotional position, and that's why you can explain sometimes and it doesn't sink in right away, or there's like a resistance or even anger when you explain the topic. So there's different factors there. It's not as simple. I've found, because initially I thought it was just going to be, oh, you just explain this and we move on, and I realized this is a lot about emotions and kind of worldviews and communities as much as it is about knowledge. So yeah, I think that's a crucial component of understanding this, and I don't have the perfect answer for how to address that. But I think putting out the accurate information is certainly part of the solution. But I've learned that it's sometimes the impact is not what it could be, because it's not like we're having a completely abstract, objective conversation. People have these beliefs because they match an anecdote, or they match a preference, or they like an influencer, and so they resist anything that goes against that. It's just human nature.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And we learn to cherry pick, and people. It's almost like a religion when you get attached to a certain way of eating, and our food is so important to us, and it's an important part of the tribe we belong to, which matters to people more than just about anything. And so they'll do whatever they can to find, whatever is available that matches their position, and they'll reject what doesn't. And I can remember, this is a interesting, when Dean Ornish's Lifestyle Heart Trial came out in 1990, and I can remember beginning to go to some of Dean's retreats and met the people who were part of that original study. And one of the reasons I was there is I consulted a little bit regarding omega-3 fatty acids, because Dr. Ornish was starting to get a little concerned that maybe the diet was too low in omega-3s, and I confirmed that doing some analyses, and I've had done some research articles on omega-3s and so forth. And so he started suggesting people add in a little bit of ground flaxseed. And he wasn't quite at the point where he was recommending DHA and EPA at that stage, but was recommending some omega-3s get added in. And the response of the people that were part of the study and that were there was they were so angry. They were so angry because they had learned this black and white, fat is bad, all fat is bad, and all of a sudden they were being told maybe some fat is actually good. And it was just so confusing to them, and they were angry and absolutely didn't want to hear any of it. And so when you get, when you're in a camp, it really is disconcerting and scary when somebody starts giving you strong evidence that will push you in a bit of a different direction.
So true. So true. I
see
agree
that
with
every
you.
day. Having a YouTube channel, I see that every single day. We'll make a video on a topic, and I'll have the low fat and the low carb people, and the all animal foods are poison people, and the all plant foods are poison people, and all of these different. And you can tell because of the rhetoric is very easily to identify, and the names, sometimes the username is very clear. You'll be like Low Carb Joe, or vegan this, or plant or meat that, and it's so visceral to each of these, and all of them are convinced that they're absolutely right. Sometimes it's right below. You'll see the guy saying this video is trash because you said that dairy can be consumed, and then the guy and all animal products are garbage, and then the guy below says you said vegetables are okay. you don't know what you're talking about. It's like, it's mayhem. And so people get so convinced of their worldview that they don't even listen to evidence. But I don't think that's a universal. I think it's a very strong factor. I have seen people change minds. It is a very gradual process, I would say.
I agree. Well, I think because we are at the end of the hour, I just want to really thank you, Jill, for joining Brenda and I on the podcast and sharing some of the really key myth-busting issues that we needed to address. We really care for our audience to learn and to be clearer. And I know that this is going to just contribute. It's not going to sort it, like just like your amazing videos seem to contribute, but not sort it out because people, take time, as you just mentioned. But we hope that as we actually talk about these fantasies versus facts, people also will learn how to eventually, probably, hopefully, read studies, because one thing that I see a lot online is that the carnivore camp will use a study to promote their view, but they don't explain the study or the validity of the study or the quality of it. And it becomes a big problem when someone doesn't actually know how to read a study,
Yeah.
And I just want to say thank you to Jill for being such a voice of reason and for taking so much time to set the record straight on so many issues. It's a huge service, and we're very grateful for that.
Thank you so much. My pleasure. And I'm sorry I was so scandalously late to this.
No problem. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast. And we really hope that you are going to send us a lot of questions if you have them, or feedback. We really want to have you involved into the conversation. Let's try to make things clearer with some unpacking of myth and, confirming of facts. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.